Oh, 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 oh.
Welcome to Multiple O's, the spin-off podcast for The O Show. The O Show is hosted by Dr. Oriana Fox, the artist with a PhD in self-disclosure. You hopefully know the spiel by now. If you're interested in candid confessions, creativity, nonconformity, and mental health, you've come to the right place. This, my friends, is season 2 of this podcast, which explores the crossover between working on the self and working to change the world. Have you ever said to yourself, I love that Oriana Fox makes art all the time? Well, if you have, now you can say it with your wallet. Go to patreon.com/Oriana Fox and support this lovely podcast and artist.
Hi there. Welcome back to Multiple O's. I'm your host, Dr. Oriana Fox, and I'm an artist with a PhD in self-disclosure. This week we have a brand new interview for you. Very exciting. Recently recorded with the Leeds-based artist and academic Dawn Woolley. Her new book has just been published. It's hot off the press, literally. And the title is Consuming the Body, Capitalism, Social Media, and Commodification. It's published by Bloomsbury. It's a sociological study of contemporary consumerism and the commodified construction of ideal gendered bodies, paying particular attention to the new forms of interaction produced by social networking sites. In short, there's a lot of analysis of the phenomenon of the selfie. The book describes the behaviors of an ideal neoliberal subject. That is the perfect person produced by the current form of capitalism, the kind of capitalism that promotes competitive individualism and defines human worth in economic terms. In this context, Woolley identifies the sadistic demands the market makes of us, which is how we're transformed into self-disciplining subjects. But importantly, she also highlights forms of pleasure and opportunities for subversion. As I said, the book just came out, but it's been a long time in the making, beginning as it did as a practice-based PhD research project. Probably didn't guess that from the title. The initial impetus for the research were the concerns and questions that Woolley explored in her artwork, which has taken and continues to take many forms, from still lives and photo collages to billboards and sculpture. Her work examines representations of gender in adverts, magazines, on TV, and online, in order to appropriate their visual language and expose the stereotypes they reproduce. Interestingly, she explained to me that a key motivation behind the research was having her work misunderstood. And that's where the interview begins.
I was looking at how still life can present like the contemporary consumer in neoliberal capitalism. So I'd come out of doing a lot of self-portraiture work and working with cutouts of myself in, the Substitute series where, like in a relationship with a real man and a two-dimensional photograph of me. But I'd kind of found that this work was taken out of context online because it had kind of gone all over the place. And I found some images on a blog that were in Chinese, so I kind of got it roughly translated. And the person, I think, had assumed that I was a male artist and that I'd basically made these images of my ideal relationship because I had a girlfriend who was paper and couldn't speak back or something along those lines. So, and you're just like... oh, this has gone in a direction I did not think it was going to go in. And so I spent quite a bit of time thinking, how do I lock down the meaning of the female body to prevent these kind of decontextualizations happening?
Yes.
And that I kind of, in a slightly defeatist way, went to still life rather than actually try it. I was like, oh, it can't be done. It's terrible. But I'd been looking at Dutch still life and genre paintings for a while and using the symbolism from those. So, I don't know how much you know about genre paintings, but generally there are people in them doing things, but then they are described through objects. So there'll be there might be oyster shells on the floor suggesting that a woman is wanton and,
Or the dog is like a symbol of fidelity and
or the cat,
right.
infidelity. And so it's kind of interesting how objects could describe people and whether that could be taken out of this context of 17th century paintings that are not common language for people today, to kind of create that visual language of symbols for now. So I could talk about these kind of relationships to consumption and body, gender, and everything else, but through objects, and kind of sidestep the female body entirely.
Right. So like taking a note from Mary Kelly.
Yeah.
For those not in the know, Mary Kelly is a feminist artist who back in the 1970s took the stance, and she continues the stance today, that female bodies cannot be represented without being co-opted by the patriarchal gaze, and as such, decidedly never or very rarely includes depictions of bodies in her work, instead often using objects as stand-ins for people.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, so that's kind of what I began my PhD with.
That's so fascinating. That's so interesting that it was like your images having moved to this other context and been misunderstood would prompt.
But I mean, you can't even say they were misunderstood. They were just like a person gave their meaning to them. So
right, they gave their meaning.
Had it, right, that's what they meant in that context. So it's kind of like that kind of the slipperiness of images, and particularly in a network society where once they've travelled, they are free to be whatever anybody says they are. So that I think that's weirdly why I also ended up looking at selfies, which a PhD about still life, you might not expect to go in that direction either. And I was pretty surprised, to be honest. But it just felt unavoidable to look at it when thinking of what is the contemporary consumer now, and how we consume each other actually now on social media. So yeah, the body sort of slipped back in a couple of years later in the form of the selfie, but not into the artwork at that point. Although they also got a little bit more bodily. I started working vertically rather than on a horizontal still life table. So I was kind of having objects that were mounted into boards. And also in the series called Pacifier, the objects that I use were these nail art practice dummies, which are just a little plastic thing like that people practice nail art on, and also a sex toy called a fleshlight, which is basically a squishy tube with a mouth on it. So I was kind of using those, and they had like dummy lollies and things in them. So yeah, for still life because it's objects, but also kind of presented as a portrait of a particular type of consumer.
And that's interesting because I guess a portrait is about an individual as opposed to a type, but your still lives were about type rather than individual. Interesting that in the book, you're very much focused on like a neoliberal identity, that this is not actually an actual living person, but this is kind of what the ideal neoliberal subject is, and how is that constructed, and what are the demands that the market makes to produce this particular subject. So it's like a type as opposed to individual.
Yeah.
But of course, it's based on research into the actual impact of things like social media on individuals. One of the facts you cite in the book that most interested me was the kind of cyclical roller coaster of mostly negative emotions that come with taking selfies. Yeah, that people produce selfies to get these likes, to get these affirmations, get the positive feedback, even though that might make them feel better momentarily. Ultimately, it leads to depression because it's always only upward comparison, because people are only presenting the qualities that get the likes, and I won't say their best qualities, but like their most whatever mass appealing qualities, and then so it's always upward comparison as opposed to downward, and therefore you always end up feeling. It was a cycle, wasn't it? It was self-perpetuating cycle of selfie, low self-esteem, more selfie to get the likes, and, like kind of.
Yeah. And even when, so one of the psychology research experiments found that actually there was a little bit of a lift in self-esteem. And it was very specific. It was like face satisfaction. That's where they saw a slight bump after a good selfie that had good feedback. But even then, they found that the satisfaction levels went down below their original level after that sort of spike in satisfaction had worn off. So it's not only that it's not maintained, but it actually causes a further reduction, which then
it's so weird. It's a bit like reminds me of dieting. Like you diet and then you gain even more weight, so you have to go back. It's like almost exactly the same kind of equation or something.
Yeah, exactly. Weird. Yeah, and that's a good kind of analogy actually. That kind
But then the advice is like never go on a diet, right?
Yeah.
Like, so wouldn't the advice then be never take a selfie?
or take them, but not in a way that
basically the psychological effects are pretty soundly like negative on self-esteem and stuff. But if people don't produce selfies, then we're deprived of like having a visual culture where there's diversity represented.
Yeah. Well, that's it. If you think about how self-presentation was available to people pre-social media. Like you could take your own images and things, but they would not. They would stay within your own circles, and anything more widely distributed would have to go through the kind of professional media gatekeepers. So the potential to really diversify that culture and to give people presence that are maybe not so visible in the past, that's also proven. And there are some great artists or creatives of all different types who are using social media in really interesting ways to kind of foreground ideas of diversity. Alok, Menon, and they talk about their social media accounts as presenting all the facets of their identity. So like the idea of a series of selfies and self-portraits enable people to show an identity that is not fixed and stable and, fixed within binary structures, and so on. So I think, social media creates those spaces, and they are really important, and they are, I think, feeding upwards into wider media.
Yeah. Because they were just on Queer Eye, or they're always on, I don't know, I feel like they're always in the media. Alok is such a good example of someone who is putting themselves out there and challenging norms, and particularly around gender, which is exactly, the what I studied in my PhD was artists who challenge norms and expectations of identity and speak truth to power using themselves and their identity as the kind of fodder for their work. And so that's kind of, I guess, where our interests overlap a bit, is in this, how do we challenge these norms, like whether they're capitalistic or patriarchal. Mm-hmm. But also in your analysis, you talk about before and after and the makeover paradigm, which again is something that I've been really interested in my research. So, and in my art practice, I've been interested in that. So, but yeah, I hadn't thought about the fact, like, there was some really interesting stuff in there about like fat people being stuck in the before, always the one that needs to be exceeded and worked to get beyond. I don't know. I hadn't ever thought about that. Yeah.
There's some great kind of fat theory academics talking about that. I'm quite interested in temporalities around the body as well, and I think that before and after strategy obviously pervades a lot of commercial culture around, like cosmetics and body labor. So there's always this idea of the transformation that never ends. You're always becoming this ideal of yourself. And I think it's Hillel Schwartz talks about the future conditional relationship to yourself, which I think like really resonated about kind of how we the relationship we have to ourselves in general now, I think, in consumer culture. And it's also against a backdrop of anti-aging products being targeted at teenagers. It's like if you're female, you pretty much start aging as soon as you've kind of reached your full height. So yes, anti-aging products have also been a bit of a focus for me over the years, because I think they are quite a fascinating set of commodities in the kind of branding that they have, the names and things, because that is that idea of the future it messes with the idea of the future conditional in a way, because it's telling you to reverse, and it's all like age reverse, time delay, stop time, and so on. So then you have this weird paradoxical thing where you're trying to attain your future conditional, which is also an image of you in the past, before you aged. So
right.
So I
that reminds me of like a piece by Martha Wilson, who was in her late 20s, early 30s, where she pictures herself as an older woman wanting to look younger.
Mm-hmm.
The piece I just mentioned by Martha Wilson is called Posturing, Age Transformation, and it's a piece she made in 1973.
Well, I did a performance called The Mystical Scientist, which I would perform at conferences. It kind of dressed up as a pseudo-scientist stroke beautician kind of person, and explaining the physics of time delay products using block universe theory. And kind of tongue-in-cheek, but also quite seriously unpacking this weird temporality of anti-aging products, and also why they tend to get banned by the Advertising Standards Authority, because if they say anything that sounds like it's going to be a permanent change, for example, they tend to be banned as misleading, and they have to talk about it being a temporary improvement. But the mystical scientist kind of argues that actually, because of the block universe in which past, present, and future all kind of coexist but are temporally distant, it's kind of illogical to talk about temporary changes and things, because like time is already there in its segments. So to kind of go back to a future conditional but past body that's younger, you just have to find the right slice of space-time and kind of figure out how to get there, and that's what the anti-aging products are kind of trying to help us to do. But yeah, so that's a kind of and it's called The Mystical Scientist because I was also really interested in how the commodities tend to blend nature, science, and mythology. It's like they're trying to capture all audiences and all belief systems. So there's a range of products by The Body Shop called Drops of Youth, and they sell themselves as containing stem cells from marine plants. So you've got kind of science and nature there already. But then in the adverts, they say there's also a few drops of the fountain of youth. And it just cracks me up because it's like, that's a really wide net you're casting there. So that's kind of how The Mystical Scientist was born, because I felt like you needed all those elements in there to kind of be believable as an anti-aging product. So
that's so funny. But I mean, what I thought was really interesting about the discussion of aging was, I was like, ooh, because you talk about psychoanalytical ideas on aging, and that healthy aging entails acceptance and kind of incorporating of change and loss, and that's exactly what the products don't help you do.
Yeah, it's this idea of like, as we go through life, we become more integrated, and that our kind of minds, bodies, and expectations and everything ideally get closer together and less kind of in friction with each other. But yeah, if you're constantly told not to accept your flaws, you're being prevented from a calm and happy life, I think.
Yeah, which adds to the like sadistic nature of of the demands. Maybe it would be good to say more, I think, for like someone who hasn't read the book, which it only just came out, right? Or it's coming out. When did it come?
It's not out yet.
It's not out yet.
It comes out in October, though. It's being printed somewhere in the world.
Okay. All right.
But yeah, so
we're not doing spoilers, but
no.
We want to say something that's gonna like make people want to go out and buy that.
Yeah,
book.
I mean, there are no cliffhangers at the end to spoil. Really, it's like it's called "Consuming the Body: Capitalism, Social Media, and Commodification," and it's kind of I don't think there's going to be there isn't really the uplifting end or the great romance or anything. So. It's a fairly bleak story, but yeah. So the bit of that kind of the kernel that remained from my thesis is the idea that actually our relationships to ourselves and to the wider consumer culture have sort of structural similarities to some pathologies. So you mentioned the kind of sadism of the commands that come from capitalism through like advertising and magazines, social media, and so on, that tell us that we are not good enough but can be better with the right commodities, and for all the things that you said before, it's kind of an endless cycle, and the goalposts endlessly change as well, and then this is kind of supported by a way of looking at ourselves and each other that is quite a fetishistic, dissecting mode of looking. So we cut our bodies up into bits to be improved, and this really replicates the way that advertising presents bodies as well, like through before and after, problem sections in cosmetic surgery adverts or close-ups of skin and wrinkles or whatever in other commodity adverts. So and we internalize that and we kind of come to view ourselves in those ways, which resembles the way that a fetishist focuses in on the fetish object in order not to see the bigger picture. In a way, it's kind of like a defense mechanism to stop yourself seeing something that you find traumatizing. And then the other kind of mode of communication is a hystericized form of self-presentation, which is why I kind of look at selfies. And hysteria is characterized as, or hysterics are characterized as being perfectionists, being very competitive. So there's like a lot of rivalry, one-upmanship, and escalation of behaviors. What are the other things? It's
very hyper-gendered. Like they reflect in their self-presentation. Like
the ideal man or woman.
The ideal. Yeah.
And how actually I think social media is a platform and a very visual space for presenting selves and bodies, produces this hystericized space in which to present yourself, which in turn I think hystericizes our modes of expression. And because social media is really characterized by rivalry, one-upmanship, like wanting to get more likes, more tweets, and an escalation therefore of behaviors and of gender expressions, I think it just kind of that the character of the hysteric maps onto that kind of generic ideal neoliberal social media user as kind of those are actually the idealized behaviors of the societies in which we live, and all of these three modes of communication support each other and continue that cycle and accelerate and intensify it. That's the kind of the broad base that the book starts on, and then kind of goes into detail looking at selfies and other instances where these ideal characters are kind of formed in the world. So like I look at self-tracking and quantification. I look at relationships to food, so eating disorders as expressions of responses or reactions to these expectations. And then end on a positive note by what we could do instead to kind of get out of this like death cycle of social media and expectation and so on. So it does have a happy ending, sort of. But
you also talk about like attempts that have been made to do something different. Like I'm thinking of like body positivity, but how they just, what you find is that they just sort of reproduce that same or a similar breaking down of the body into problem areas, and or like health at any size movement just mirrors the kind of I don't know, normative expectations of like healthiness.
Yeah.
They fall into kind of traps sometimes themselves, like even though they're trying to do something different and counter normative ideals, and they end up falling into it again.
Yeah, and I think it's like even things like organizations or movements, whatever, that begin in a very radical way, do tend to be incorporated and homogenized into these slightly positive but not really no longer radical things. So like the body positivity movement kind of got hijacked by attractive white heteronormative people, or maybe slightly larger bodies or slightly different looks, but yeah, no longer actually providing a space for genuinely different people. And I think that's just part of the process, isn't it? Like that, one of the critiques of capitalism and about how brilliant it is that it can just absorb, and it can take criticism and change a little bit in order to then absorb that criticism. So like it's, since the 70s, that's been happening with feminist critiques. And they just end up being advertising slogans time and time again. So I think it's just an endless process of keeping ahead or coming up with new things that are then maybe harder to incorporate. And I think you see that now with the kind of queer cultures and LGBTQI things, that they are also becoming highly commodified and profitable. So, I think there is a big movement, like in the Pride movement, to kind of move away from these sort of spectacles that are, sponsored by big corporations that probably don't have brilliant track records in the kind of those respects to begin with. There is an awareness of this process as well. So, and again, it goes back to that question of like, how do you do something that is not productive? Like, how do you make something that's radical that can't be incorporated and turned into either some sort of branding mechanism or a commodity? And it's just like, I don't know. Who knows?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that may be the question that I continue to ask myself in different sort of areas and or with different case studies forever, basically.
It was really interesting to hear about, to read about Goffman's 1976 study of 500 adverts in magazines, and kind of coming up with how gender ideals are represented and kind of reinforced through the posing in advertisements, and how those same tropes are then found in selfies and on social media. You were talking about how like female models are more likely to be off balance or lying down, and it infers inferior social position or lack of emotional balance or subordinate, and like averted eyes as like subordinate social status. And as you were saying that about being off balance, I was like, oh, that really reminds me of, I think it's a Hellenistic relief of Nike putting on her sandal, or it's some kind of Greek goddess like putting on a sandal, and because I've like used that as an example in like an art history lecture, like of like the difference between how women were depicted. So these images are perpetuated in magazines in 1976 when Goffman's doing it, and now you're seeing how they're in social media, and it's like it even goes back to like antiquity.
I would love,
like the sculpture.
I would love to do that research.
I have to show you a picture of it.
To really do a linear.
But then it was like, then the next page was you posing in exactly the same pose as this Nike. Yeah, it's exactly, it's identical. So yeah, it was so funny. I was like,
yeah. See, I've got that library of body gestures in there as well. That I clearly just, we know how to pick the kind of right moves, but yeah, it's fascinating. In another piece of co-authored work that is currently in production, which is a book chapter in a book called digital painting photography, which came out of it's the third in a series of conferences that look at the kind of overlaps between digital painting and photography as medias. And myself and my collaborator Zara Worth write about each of us has a sort of painting series that draws on imagery from social media, and then we also describe some work by an artist called Caspar, and he on a series that he's working on currently, he pairs images of like weeping saints or saints generally from historical paintings with screen grabs of TikTokers to kind of make this equivalence between the gestures and expressions and things, and they are very close. But in that, we kind of, I guess, argue that it's not a lack of authenticity, but it's just that we have this like lexicon of body language that goes throughout art history, that we draw upon and recreate. So on social media, people would be criticised for being inauthentic and, not creative or whatever. But it's actually like, are any of us, really producing something unique that is new, or are we all just like cherry picking poses out of this kind of the visual language that has been building forever? So I'm really interested in this language of gestures. And actually, I started to think about an iconography of selfies when I was looking at hysteria whilst writing my thesis. Because I don't know if you know much about the Salpêtrière Hospital and the kind of treatment of hysteria there, but Charcot kind of was really interested in like understanding the visual characteristics of these attacks of hysteria. So he had the hysterics attacks documented photographically. They had a photography studio installed in the hospital, and he also like drawings, engravings, you name it. He wanted to come up with an iconography of hysteria, like this kind of, sequence of poses and gestures that were expected in a hysterical attack. And I always thought it'd be quite interesting to try and come up with that sort of iconography of selfies, like what are the kind of key moves, the key poses, but then to trace them back through different cultures and different sort of art histories. I could see that being a fun project to do.
Well, it also makes me think of, I don't know if you know this work by Sonia Avekiewicz, where it's like she's found these photographs from her own archive, like of personal photographs of herself, and she matches them to advertising imagery. Like from her whole life, like as a girl, like a little girl, schoolgirl, all the way up to being an adult. But they're like just candid shots from her own, like just from her own photographs. But the poses in them are identical to the ones she finds in advertising. And it's like this weird, it's, again, I guess it's about like before and after, or subverting that. It's like she wasn't copying them. It was so ingrained, like these kind of tropes of femininity, they sort of get incorporated and then reperformed, and so it's I always think of that.
And I think that explains the kind of prevalence in selfies as well, doesn't it? It's that the images that we see, which tend to be the magazine images, advertising images, and so on, kind of teach us how to behave when a camera is pointed at us. That's kind of like how we sort of learn how to do it. But then I think it's a bit more complicated than that also, in that sometimes, and I think they're talking about how selfies are used in advertising and how they kind of have this interesting and a bit paradoxical relationship to authenticity. So like if there's selfies in adverts, or if celebrities are taking selfies as adverts, they're seen to be candid and, someone just in their life going about their sort of usual business. But then selfie takers are viewed as being inauthentic because they are posing and they're idealizing themselves, probably using filters or being selective, taking a number of images. So So there's this kind of paradoxical thing.
As if that's not going on for the celebrities.
Well, exactly. And they don't have stylists and, lighting and things. And yeah, it's completely ridiculous. But then, and I think this is also true in adverts. Like, I think there is sometimes an attempt to look naturalistic as well. So it's like these poses aren't just coming from the corporate world into our daily lives. It's like the kind of daily life is feeding in as well. So I think it's more of almost like a collaborative development of a language of gestures rather than simply this kind of imposed from above thing. So, and that could be interesting. Like, what if you just start a craze for a really weird gesture that then, infiltrates into the corporate world? So then you see them on the catwalk or.
Well, there's that. What is it like?
Yeah. Well, I don't. I have.
What is it called?
Yeah, I've got a nephew who's the right age for that, but I don't get it. So I've seen it, but I don't know what it is.
I'll have to insert that into what the heck that's called. But I think I found out about it like 10 years too late or 5 years too late. I think whatever that is.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's like that.
Exactly. So it can work the other way. So we've just got to come up with a really amusing set of moves that we can try and make viral, and then we will see this. We'll inflict them on celebrities, essentially, if we can do it. So,
but yeah, I wanted to talk about that, like the authenticity being a commodity. Because as I was reading it, I was thinking, because basically when I use social media, like it's pretty much only to promote myself as an artist. Like, yes, I see what other people are doing, but it's not like maybe I might keep in touch with friends a little bit on there, but like it's mostly just like, and as a consequence, like I don't do very well because the algorithm sees right through me and just won't share my posts. Like, we know what you're doing now. So yeah, so for me, like the upward and downward comparison is like all to do with my career. Mm-hmm. Like, and I'm sure, and I know I get a sense of like when I email someone out of the blue, they're like, oh, it looks like you're doing really well. And I'm always like, that's just because that's that self I'm presenting. Like, it's so clearly they're seeing this warped thing that's like not at all what's going on with me, And so I feel like, oh, well, maybe one way to disrupt it is like to and people do that all the time. Like they share like the bad stuff, mm-hmm. or like you see them like, oh, I didn't get the Arts Council grant, or they, and you think, oh, maybe I should try that tactic of like exposing the things that go wrong or something. But I feel like then that authenticity mm-hmm. is just another, like, it's just another commodity that like, oh, I like that person now more because she shared that she didn't get the grant or whatever. I don't know. It just.
Yeah. I think there are positives for, like sharing the failures just to kind of create a more balanced view that, or maybe just to give some people who feel like they're always just rejected and never get the successes, that kind of sense that actually we all get the rejections. I think it is healthy to share that. But then social media used to be really about positivity, right? And Facebook did this experiment to find out if emotions are contagious. And so they, this is the least ethical experiment ever, or no, not the least. There have been some terrible experiments throughout history, but contemporary-wise, when hopefully we take ethics a bit more seriously, they kind of basically pushed the negative content for some people and positive content for others to see what happened. And they found that people, if you get a lot of negative stuff on your feed, you disengage, right? And Facebook wants people to be on there as much as possible, clicking as much as possible, because it creates data commodities and attention commodities, so for advertisers. So they want to think about how they can boost people being on there. So positivity was seen as this thing, and it's like, it was the culture of likes. So before there was a dislike or the angry button, or there was just the like to begin with, but actually more recently they have found that anger, outrage, all the nasty negative stuff just gets people going as much, and like people tend to engage more actually to the quite aggressive, nasty articles and things. So yeah, there's been this kind of, the algorithm pushes negative things towards you that it thinks will make you angry because you're more likely to respond. And actually, someone at Facebook did this experiment where they made up two accounts. I think one was called Karen and one was called Carol. They were both sort of similar ages in, standard town in the States somewhere. And one was a liberal and one was a Republican. And without really doing anything on their accounts, they found that within 2 weeks they were getting, the algorithm was sending them articles that were either really pro or really anti-Trump. They tended to allude to illegal behaviour, violence, all sorts of things. So it's like it escalated without them actually posting anything further about themselves to encourage it. So now the algorithm is not out there to make you happy and keep you clicking. It's to make you angry. So I wonder whether showing your disappointments online is all, it's like we can't really win. Like if we're too positive, we're doing the shiny happy social media thing, but then if we're too negative, we're probably just also feeding that algorithm. So in some ways I just think do what feels good for you, because we're all just within this system that we can't control. But no, there must be a more positive positive. And I was going to say productive, and I'm like, no, don't use that word. Like, challenging, radical. Yeah, I'm sure there are ways. And actually, maybe it's posting about really boring stuff. Because I feel like if it's not spectacular, it's not aspirational, it doesn't move anyone in any way. And I think if you just flooded social media with that, it would slow down the cycle, perhaps. But it was, we'd all disengage because it's boring. So then we're kind of undoing the joys of social media as well. So
then that would be the biggest win, actually, I think. Because then we'd bring them down.
Yeah, we
wouldn't have to do this anymore.
We just bring out our most authentic, dull selves.
Feeling really negative about it.
Do a blow-by-blow account of your supermarket shop. So yeah, maybe that's the solution. It's a hard one to get behind with any sense of enthusiasm.
Oh, but it's so upsetting. It makes me feel so upset.
Yeah. Yeah, but I do think finding these small disruptions are at least creating ourselves a little bit of breathing space within these spaces, and maybe allowing them to perform their positive potential that is otherwise crowded in by these commercial and disciplining practices. So yeah, I'm not totally defeated. I haven't given up. I do think there are interventions that we can do to create gaps. That's I've realised, and I think it's through doing billboard work that rather than, because generally the Arts Council has supported those projects or other kind of funding organisations to enable me to buy billboard spaces, and obviously in the monitoring and evaluation bit, it's always a bit tricky to talk about the impact that these things on the street have. And I mean, you can talk about footfall because that's how the marketing companies sell those spaces anyway. But you can't really say that anyone looked at it or, it changed or did anything, So I came to the kind of conclusion that actually just creating a space in the visual environment that isn't trying to sell you something is positive enough in its own right without expecting some big like change of behaviours or thinking or anything else. So maybe that's the aim to have for social media as well. Create gaps, moments to, breathe and feel better.
That sounds good. That does sound good. Yeah, because I mean, I just think about that idea of like healthy aging and having an integrated self that accepts change and loss. Like, I feel like that could be applied not just to appearance, obviously, but to the other things that social media might be making you feel less worthwhile about. Yeah, that like I just should accept, whatever change and loss and whatever as just part of my development, as opposed to, always thinking in this individualistic, competitive way. Oh, which reminds me of the thing I wanted to ask you, because you keep mentioning collaboration. Is collaboration maybe a way to kind of get beyond the individualism of neoliberalism?
Yeah, maybe. I mean,
Maybe.
From my perspective, like I'm currently collaborating with, kind of 3 different collaborations, kind of working on slightly different but related topics with people. And I do find that we end up in places with the artwork or with writing with other people that I would not have got to on my own, and they wouldn't have got to on their own. So there is something genuinely kind of creative in that sort of space for discussion that collaborations produce. I've got a journal article, a co-authored one that's in, review stage at the moment. In lockdown, my friend, who's another academic but a human geographer called AC Davidson, we were talking about social media generally, and one of their colleagues had shared with them an Instagram account called Girls of Isolation, saying, "Oh, isn't this great? It's a space where people can express themselves, and it's just sort of a nice community." But when we looked at them, there were a lot of quite, classic black and white portraits, stroke sort of maybe magazine editorials of quite attractive, slim white women. So we're like, well, it's nice, but it's not exactly, it doesn't feel that inclusive. And it's a very particular type of femininity that is being celebrated here. So out of that, the Boys of Isolation Instagram account was born, which is spelled BOI, as in the kind of queer boy, where we invited people to submit selfies that queered gender binaries, basically. And we also ran a few workshops online to kind of test out ideas for doing that. And so AC is a human geographer, so they were very interested in spaces and places for selfies. And then I was obviously more interested in the gestures and the objects that people depicted themselves with. But yeah, so the article that is going to be out at some point in the future is kind of writing up what we found from that. And actually some of the conclusions for my book borrowed some of those ideas from participants in the workshops. I should say it is referenced and acknowledged. I haven't just stolen those ideas. But that did really help me to open out my thinking about what is a selfie and how can we, get away from this, like the individualism that's so championed by neoliberalism, the emphasis on what the body looks like rather than what it does. And also that kind of linearity of events that social media loves, that kind of pin you down into a very particular timeline. But also for the Boys of Isolation workshops, we started to do a kind of final activity at the end of the workshops that people could opt into if they wanted to, which was to create a collaborative selfie using the, the displays that Zoom affords, so you can have kind of everyone pictured together. And we did some exquisite corpse selfies where everyone takes a different part of the body and then you kind of do a screenshot.
Yes, I saw that on one of those. That was really nice. Yeah, that's awesome.
So that as a kind of collaboration of actually producing images gets away from the kind of individualistic expectation of selfies. And I think also kind of detracts from that, the foregrounding of appearance, because they're just quite funny, comical, weird images. So I think actually collaboration in many forms could kind of have the potential to move away from some of the kind of problems of the ideal neoliberal subject.
Yeah, I feel envious about the collaboration thing. I guess, well, maybe my practice is sort of always reaching out to other people, but it's not, I feel not the same as collaboration. But yeah, it's just to go back to, we were talking about the stuff about hysteria in the book. And yeah, it's really interesting the way you build up the discussion, like really looking in detail at that diagnosis, and then applying it to our context. Just the idea that the ideal neoliberal identity is pathological, and even health, like even the pursuit of health can become a pathology. Really interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think there are so many sort of indications of that. So, like I talk about the kind of subsets of eating disorders, like orthorexia, which is about like eating so healthily that you become malnourished, and then athletic nervosa, which is kind of posited by some psychologists as that kind of that tends to be young men's kind of pathological pursuit for the kind of ideal muscular build for men, which is kind of also unattainable, like the slender ideal for women, and how these notions of health are really wrapped into these gender ideals that are really about appearance. So slenderness, which actually isn't seen as, or sort of tests have shown that actually being slender isn't always necessarily the healthiest, that your body kind of needs some reserves if it gets ill. So yeah, and then muscularity for men as well can also become pathological. Health has become a sort of cover for talking about appearance, and this is like a lot of the kind of anti-obesity rhetoric, I think, also feeds into that, where there's a conflation between what's healthy and what's attractive, and what's unhealthy and what's unattractive. So they become exchangeable, essentially. And a lot of the research that's been done on social media, like around fitspiration and that kind of thing, kind of shows that fit also means attractive, or maybe only means attractive some of the time. And that there is also a real dangerous overlap and visual similarities between fitspiration, thinspiration, and bonespiration, which is the kind of the extreme end of the pro-anorexia kind of imagery. So yeah, there is like that notion of health has just become split into different things, and it's very sort of moralizing as well. Like we kind of view health as goodness and good citizenship. You know, you look after yourself so you're not a burden on state or family or so on. So yeah, there's a whole lot of things all wrapped up and mixed up with ideas of attraction and physical appearance, which is why I'm looking at the quantified self movement and self-tracking and these ideas of optimization, and what does it mean, and what where's that line between healthy and unhealthy in that kind of pursuit of control around the body. So health has become a little bit of a bugbear for me as well. Like, and I'm always like, well, what do you mean by health? Whose health? What is health? You know. But it's hard to argue against health as a notion as well, because people hard. Just think you're crazy. You're like, why do you not want to be healthy, or why do you think health is bad? Yeah. If it's not problematized or challenged or evaluated, then it does become the thing that it is, which is like, it's not actually about health at all now. It's about a lot of other things, and it becomes a way to discriminate against people, discipline them, and just treat them, exclude them from society, essentially. So I think it is something that needs to be discussed more and challenged more.
Yeah. And there was an interesting point, the idea of men keep fit and women's bodies are sort of like inherently wrong because they're not male.
Yeah.
That idea I thought was so...
Yeah, the female body is deemed to be something that needs to be controlled.
Right.
Whereas the male body is something that is, maintained.
Right.
And it's also this idea of like the difference between slimming down and building up. And so the building up is, it just kind of has this much more positive idea. You know, it's about enlarging, creating, and so on, whereas the kind of reduction of the body is also diminishing, right? So, and psychology tests have shown that even though I think they tend to look at college age students probably because they're done in university, so they have like a captive test subject audience. But the men and women both pursue health and fitness in order to improve their appearances, but they find that the men do experience increased body satisfaction and, esteem and so on, whereas the women tend not to, even if they do a lot of sport. And it is this idea that it's that idea of trying to, keep this control, and it, like, being healthy and fit is just one of many sort of disciplinary forms that the female has to go through, such as being careful about what you eat and so on, whereas the male is seen as being able to just build up and, it's sort of job done. So it's not this like endless list of a regime that never ends. Oh, and, anti-aging stuff, and, it's like every bit of the female body has to be controlled, whereas the men, just need to lift a few weights from time to time. And actually, when I first started doing the mystical scientist research for that performance, I only found one male anti-aging product, and it was called Age Active, whereas all the ones for women are like time delay, turn back time, age resist, whereas the men's just like Age Active. So you just, and it does feel like more of an integrated relationship, right? You're just active within it, maybe just doing it well rather than trying to stop it. So I think there's a whole interesting thing around the ideologies of commodity names and the kind of promises that they make, or the threats that they issue through how they're named, and how that is very gendered.
Yeah. So we talked about gender and aging and weight, but your book also deals with like race. So maybe we should say something about that because we haven't talked about it at all.
Yeah, and well, it's another of those examples of how kind of capitalism takes on board criticism, but sort of absorbs it and neutralizes it. So, there've been people campaigning for greater racial diversity in advertising and popular culture for, a long time. And there have been improvements. But, even like bell hooks, and I can't remember the exact date of the essay, but they talk about how when Black women are presented, like in fashion photography, they tend to be there as these quite wild things. So their bodies are contorted. They're sort of almost presented as not quite human or other. Whereas if they are paler skinned women, tend to be slim and have maybe straightened hair. So they look much more Western, but are still Black. They tend to be sexualized. So it's kind of like, and these stereotypes still exist, and the colorism still exists. So like the lighter you are, the more positively you'll be portrayed, and the more frequently you'll be portrayed. So it's kind of like there's a slight expansion of the types of bodies that are shown, but they still really conform to the ideals. And they still tend to be quite white ideals. There's a whole consumer culture around that as well. So like skin lightening products, hair relaxants, and those kind of things are presenting you to yourself as not white enough, essentially, to be acceptable. So it's like you have the Black women are expected to change their appearances to become more acceptable. And also within writing around this sort of advertising, there's the idea that you kind of gain maybe a kind of edginess or a coolness by having some racial diversity in your campaigns, but it's not to the extent that it will alienate your white consumers. So you can kind of harvest from Black culture without really truly supporting it or representing it. Much the same that happens with the kind of queer cultures. how they also tend to be quite, when people are depicted, they tend to still be quite classically attractive and, ticking a lot of the boxes of quite white heteronormative culture. So it's kind of how capitalism and how visual culture is absorbing criticism and absorbing some codes, but then totally neutralizing them as well and making them white, and also taking any politics out of representations of those people.
But also another really important point you make is that it makes racism like an individual problem with an individual solution, like become whiter, but like somehow buy into these products and these treatments that will make you appealing according to white standards, and then that it makes the individual person's responsibility instead of it being like, let's look at structural racism and the reasons behind why we have these white standards, or somehow do work on these wider structural issues
or
systemic
expect
issues.
The racist to change, make them more comfortable, and then maybe you won't be discriminated against quite so much. So it is. It's discipline in kind of all of those ways to like making people conform. Not that people are made to do it, but there are also, like reward systems within that. So it's been shown that people, like the research on colorism, like if your skin is lighter, you are more likely to be married, live in a better neighborhood, have a better paid job. And so there are structural reasons to encourage people to undertake these practices. It's not just so you look, more acceptable. There are very tangible incentives, but none of it challenges the system that puts those inequalities in place in the first place. The same arguments can be applied to the kind of fat discrimination as well.
Yeah. More about capitalism and like your use of Marx and the idea of commodity fetishism concealing the social aspect of a commodity, but how social media, it's the workers' labor that's concealed by the social nature of the sites. I thought that was such a good point. Like we're all working for free for these platforms.
Yeah, and we're kind of working to make ourselves easier to advertise to as well. So it's kind of like the more we tell the world what we like, which social media does that because it has the like button, and the more valuable we become as an attention commodity, because there's a higher chance that whatever they advertise to you will kind of hit the mark. And I've certainly experienced that on social media. Like, although sometimes you still get the crazy things where you're just like, what did I write in a post that made you think this was appropriate to send to me? There's some interesting writing on data doubles and also the predictiveness of algorithms. So like on Amazon or Netflix or wherever, it'll say you watch this, so maybe you'll like this. And the idea is that they basically pair you potentially with other real people that have watched similar things to you, and then essentially you and this other person wherever in the world that you don't know are kind of recommending to each other. So like if they watch something, it will pop up on your recommendations and vice versa. It's this idea that we could have a data double that might actually be a real person.
They should like combine it with dating sites.
You like this?
You watch the same.
Why not phone Pete in Mexico?
He might be your soulmate.
Yeah. Do you know, I hope you haven't got a smartphone switched on, because that idea has just gone somewhere. We're going to see it in like 6 months' time. But it's a good idea in a very dystopian, slightly terrifying.
If you're
way.
willing to move for love, willing to relocate, tick this box on your Netflix
and then
profile.
Suddenly you've got lots of removal company adverts as well in your feed. And then like maybe a few months later, divorce lawyers just in case to kind of hedge your bets, Yeah, it's like a life narrative through algorithm recommendations. I feel like that might be the self-portrait I need to explore next. Like, who do these algorithms think I am?
Right. Well, that reminds me of Erica Scorti's work. She did a self-portrait in AdWords or whatever.
Yeah, no, and I love her work. I always follow what she's doing because it's so interesting.
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, again, like the positives of social media is that, you know, this ability to self-represent and to have this diversity of voices and images and types of people represented. But then the problem becomes like beating the algorithm to make that popular, to like somehow get that to be. And I do wonder, like, how does that happen? Like, because like I can think of examples where like something really powerful happened with selfies for a minority group. And I do wonder, like, how did they get it to be, maybe it was like, maybe there's like some sort of something in the news cycle, or I don't know.
Yeah, maybe it is.
Because like there were some great examples in yours, like some things that like obviously I'm familiar with, like the bathroom, trans people in bathrooms taking selfies, and thinking about, you know, bathroom laws, legislation and stuff, and that being, you know, again, like, so part of the news cycle that they kind of can gain visibility via that being, you know, current event. But then there were examples, of course, I never heard anything about before, which was, there was one, I feel like it was in South America.
Oh, well, there was some research in the use of selfies in, now I want to say Brazil, but I might actually be misremembering that.
Yeah.
Was it Brazil? And how people were taking selfies to kind of talk about the hardships of their lives in some of the poor favelas, in whichever city it was, I can't remember. I
think the point was that it wasn't in a city, like it was outside, it was rural or something that definitely wouldn't get on the map.
Yeah, and I think one of the points those researchers made was that they that kind of way into social media visually, like taking selfies, help to improve literacy of people within those communities. So it offered a kind of mode of communication that was then could then be expanded upon, and also just the values that those people have in their selfies are not, you know, they're the expected values that people that criticize selfie taking think that they have, and that, you know, they're narcissistic and just about presenting yourself as an attractive human. They these selfies were doing a lot of other things and had totally different sort of values, which is probably true actually with anyone taking selfies. People probably get more out of it than just like, oh, I look good today, you know. And actually, when you talk about how do you beat the algorithm, I'm wondering if it's like having a strength of community already online that can then flood these things with support would help to make it noticed and to kind of push it up through the ranks of these posts. But the algorithms themselves and like the tools that they use, so like Twitter has EdgeRank, I think. Oh, is that it? Was that Facebook? Anyway, they have their own things, mechanisms to determine what are the popular posts and what will be pushed. So that they kind of do, they make what's popular as they seem to be just showing what's popular by pushing things up through these ranking posts. And they do tend to be things that are already popular, like celebrity stories or things that might be a little bit controversial. Like the whole "we just need to pee" campaign is probably going to, you know, become popular again because madly the whole trans rights things are being challenged again, and our Conservative MPs seem obsessed by what sign goes on a toilet door. So yeah, we might need some more campaigns around that to challenge these thoughts again. So which is kind of depressing. We do seem to have gone backwards on quite a lot of things lately, but sorry, I keep getting into the depressing, like the positives. How do we push these forwards? And I'm like, oh no, it's depressing.
I think it comes with the territory. There's nothing.
Yeah, I think it does.
You can't sugarcoat this stuff.
No, and actually when I was writing the book, I was determined to be more positive because, like, writing my thesis, I think I did a really good job of analysing what's bad and why it's bad. So, like these structures of consumer culture and the kind of idealised neoliberal subject and so on. But that was it. It was just like, yeah, this is terrible. I was like, okay, I feel like I can't put this out in the public and just end like that. It's like, I'm good at or explaining the problems, but surely my job should also be to at least, speculate on some solutions. So yeah, I did work hard to be quite, show some of the slightly more positive, good news sort of aspects of this in amongst all the negativity, and to end on that positive of potentially this is what you could do to kind of sidestep some of these issues when taking selfies.
You said something somewhere in the book about like pleasure. Allowing yourself to engage in pleasurable activities is anti-disciplinary, and like that made me think of Bell Hooks, who you mentioned earlier, and something she says like about the oppositional gaze and how you can take pleasure in critiquing. Being critical is something that actually is pleasurable. I mean, if we can engage ourselves critically with these things, that there can be some pleasure in that, even though we don't have the pleasure of maybe identifying or being seen, but we could still have the pleasure of being critical.
Yeah, I like that idea. And yeah, that idea of how to sort of talk back and to make that into a pleasurable activity. Or how could you intervene in visual culture online in a way that challenges but is also playful and enjoyable? Yeah, don't know what the answer is, but it's a nice idea.
Well, there isn't one answer. I'm sure there's many different articulations of that could occur in that arena.
Yeah, and well, I think that's why I like the idea of an app where so it's not just me being like, okay, I'm going to try and come up with solutions for everyone on this. It's kind of like, okay, let's create some tools and let people play with it and see what they come up with, and maybe they can, kind of educate each other. And because I also think like writing this book and being an artist, it's like there's okay, so what's the answer? How do you make visual culture better? Like, because I'm an image maker, that I'm like, I feel like there's a heightened expectation that I would actually have an answer to that, whereas I don't. So it's kind of like, whereas if I was an actual sociologist writing this, I feel like there wouldn't be that same expectation. No. So I did feel like I had to put something out there in terms of ideas of what the next step would be into changing the culture. But yeah, also being like, I don't work like that, and I've just hidden in still life for 10 years now. I am not the person to really engage with this as a visual issue.
Yeah, but still life is a perfectly good alternative, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's an expression of the self without the problems of co-optation that actually presenting yourself might entail.
Yeah, and I think you can actually create quite intriguing and nuanced portraits through like combinations of objects, or sort of the way that you use material, and and how you kind of frame and contextualize it. So yeah, I would also very strongly put still life forward as a selfie solution, because I think we should just see more still lives. Maybe that could be my intervention into social media.
Oh, there we go. We got our positive ending.
Okay, you got it out of me.
I think we probably should wrap things up because I've taken so much of your time. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Thank you. You dragged the solution out of me, so it's job done. I feel like I can retire now.
You can't retire. You've got to keep making still lives.
Okay, yeah. No, right, okay. Another 5 years then.
I hope that this conversation with Dawn Woolley has got you interested in the book, Consuming the Body, which came out on the 6th of October. And there's going to be a launch event. So if you're really hankering for more conversations around this topic, then you should attend the launch event in Leeds, at Leeds Art University on the 21st of October. And if you're not in Leeds, you can attend online. I will put the link to the Eventbrite booking page in the show notes, in addition to Dawn Woolley's website, where you can see examples of her work, including the ones we've discussed. I'll also put a link to the Boys of Isolation project on Instagram, and you can contribute to that. Anyway, so in the discussion, we mentioned the artist Erica Scorti, and she's next up.
Next time on Multiple O's. Next time on Multiple
I interviewed her. I had the pleasure of speaking with Erica Scorti, who is not a post-internet artist. I was going to introduce her that way at the time, and she refuses that label. But she does make a lot of work about her relationship with social media, but other technologies in addition to digital ones. But yeah, quite a lot of it is about digital media. And so, yeah, that's something to look forward to next time on Multiple O's. We'll have the Greek-born, London-based artist Erica Scorti talking about her work from the Instagram Live series, edited for your listening pleasure.
O's. Next time on Multiple O's. Oh.
Thank you so much for listening. Really appreciate you tuning in. It could help me out a great deal if you would subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already, and if you could rate and review. There are instructions on how to do so in the show notes. And even if you don't, I'll go on accepting myself unconditionally, my life, and other people. And I hope you will too, because we're all just fallible human beings.
Oh.